Hammond Novachord was a musical instrument out of time. It weirdly straddled this line between avant-garde composers and traditional musicians. And by doing so, it kept itself out of a timeline that eventually featured instruments that were very, very much like it, which makes it a unique instrument in the history of electronic music. Many have looked back at the functionality of the Hammond Novachord and said, well, this thing is just like a modern polyphonic synthesizer. And the reason why is that the Hammond Novachord was the first to present features that became features that were common in instruments of the 1970s and 60s and now. The Hammond Novachord isn't some weird thing that we're recognizing from the past. It is a major stepping stone from the past to the present. The Hammond Novachord would be a modern synthesizer in a vintage case, if not for the fact that it just lacks voltage control that became popular in the 60s. But even so, this instrument inspired the likes of Harold Boda, Bob Moog, and Don Buchla because it was a major stepping stone in the production of technology that everyone from that point on would use. The Hammond Novachord was special because it addressed a major problem that engineers were facing in creating polyphonic electronic instruments. And that is, of course, with an electronic instrument, you need an oscillator as a tone generator. And for polyphony to happen, you need an oscillator per note. There's no getting around it. And oscillators individually were incredibly expensive things at the beginning of the 20th century. So what's a person to do? If you have an oscillator per note, you're creating an instrument that can never be a product because it's far too expensive. Hammond addressed this issue when they discovered that dividing a square wave output in half would give you a square wave of an octave lower. And simply by dividing the output of an oscillator, you had an outcome that was similar to an oscillator at a lower octave. Of course, it was a lot cheaper to make a divider than an oscillator, so really, theoretically, you could have only 12 oscillators in an instrument and have dividers providing the lower octaves of those 12 notes of the scale, which is exactly what Hammond invented when they invented the top octave divide structure, which would then go on to be used in synthesizers for many, many years, and organs. People often make reference to organs having this principle, but it did not start off as an organ function. It started off as a Novachord function. The Novachord was not an organ by their own admission. So it was organs that stole top octave divide from synthesizers and not vice versa. But anyhow, many famous synthesizers, including the ARP Omni, which became one of the most popular synthesizers of the 70s, use this functionality because it allows an economy when it comes to oscillators requiring only 12 of them. Being the technology of the time, the Hammond Novachord had over 160 vacuum tubes and a seemingly unending supply of capacitors. As mentioned before, the Hammond Novachord had 12 oscillators. The outputs of these 12 oscillators, when divided, provided the subsequent octaves present on the Hammond Novachord. Each of the notes of the Hammond Novachord had its own bandpass filter. But this was not a very functional bandpass filter and only provided one function. It was controlled by a single control, changing the overall tone of the instrument. But in this way, it was individually articulated, which makes it really special because each note also had its own amp. So in a way, the Hammond Novachord was similar to the Moog Polymoog of 1975 in that it had kind of the framework of individual articulation, but didn't quite achieve the outcomes with that individual articulation that would have made it more powerful. There was also a resonant filter bank that exists on the Novachord. And this is what gives the sense that the Novachord was, using a term that would come out many, many decades later, paraphonic, in that it only had one filter to address all of the notes, which we've already proven is not true. However, the filter that each note had was not interesting enough to be considered a filter in an articulative sense. The resonant filter bank was more of the filtering that was going on, and all of the notes were fed through it. But because we didn't have control voltage involved, it really wasn't evident that all the notes were being fed through a single filter bank, because there weren't changes over time in the outcomes of that filter. The filter was basically intended to be one where you set it, set back, and that was it. And this was the great discovery that Hammond also discovered that you won't probably think of, and that is, it was a trick. They're like, we don't need a filter per note, because if you put all these notes through the filter, you're not going to know that they're all going through a single filter. Of course, in this day and age where we have all kinds of voltage controlled effects happening with filters, it would be way more obvious because you couldn't have an individual voltage changing a filter cutoff for a single note. It would be for all the notes overall, and this is a paraphonic structure. Of course, and this was a thing that I'm not sure anyone did, but it is a thing that can be done. You can voltage control the filters yourself in real time by changing the settings with your hands while you're playing, which I have done. And it results in effects that are very similar to those as if the instrument had voltage control. So it is possible to get that outcome, but of course you've got to sacrifice a hand to control the filters. As stated earlier, each note had its own VCA, but all of the VCAs were controlled by a single control on the front panel. One could say that the Hammond Novachord was one of the first electronic keyboards to have presets, because right there on the front panel, you had the ability to switch from a percussive sound to a singing sound. The percussive sound being a sound somewhat like the piano, and the singing sound being somewhat like a violin. This is the way that you could basically create a set of settings to have a particular outcome, which is what a preset is. Of course, you could change various aspects, but this knob actually controlled multiple functions by turning it. So in a way, it is a preset system. Hammond was very excited about their function, which we would now call LFO, although there wasn't an oscillator involved. What it basically was a generator that generated multiple fluctuations in voltage that could be directed to individual oscillators, resulting in individual vibrato. And this is a really cool thing, although it was the one moving part in the whole system, because there were these functions that were happening inside this box, these little tines that were wiggling, causing this LFO output. But it was very creative and resulted in a much more realistic vibrato, like a choral vibrato, unlike the vibrato that you might experience on many organs of the time. In the way that the Novachord has all of this functionality, it is the archetype for the modern polyphonic synthesizer. It has all of the functions. It's just, of course, a sort of prototypical architecture, and that would be improved by developments in technology later. Another important part about the Novachord that you may not be thinking about is the fact that the Novachord wasn't some amazing instrument that some amazing inventor created and everyone said, wow, look at this thing you created. What it was a product created by a company to be sold. And this was a major thing because there had been a lot of electronic instruments up to 1938, a lot of them. But what they were often one-offs created by a weird inventor. They were rarely something made into a full-on product. The Novachord was a full-on product that was marketed, that was advertised, that existed in stores and was sold. Over 1,000 of them were sold, which competes with a lot of famous synthesizers that we think of as synthesizer products, only sold in the thousands, the low thousands. The Hammond Novachord is among them. And it's amazing in that respect because it was one of the first electronic instruments to be sold as a typical household product. The Hammond Novachord is special also because it, unlike so many electronic music instruments in the beginning of the 20th century, actually made its way into all sorts of recordings and media and art. Which is to say, the Hammond Novachord appeared in the scores of a lot of movies. It appeared in the background of a lot of radio shows and was used by recording musicians in famous songs. It was not a rare, weird, obscure instrument. It was a full-on product that made its way into popular culture. The Hammond Novachord was in production from 1939 to 1942, and 1,069 of them were made. The Hammond Novachord had a retail price of $1,900, which adjusted for inflation would be a very, very expensive musical instrument of its time. But of course, there were people who could afford them and did. The Hammond Novachord's production was cut short by World War II. Due to World War II, demand for novel musical instruments dropped, as well as the fact that the United States needed the components, a lot of the components that were used in the production of electronics for the war effort. Therefore, it became hard to get all of the electronic parts to make this instrument. As a result, the Hammond Novachord had to be put on pause. But after the war, the vibe had passed, and Hammond decided to not resume creation of the Hammond Novachord, and it died. So unfortunately, largely the war effort killed the Hammond Novachord. There was another element of the Hammond Novachord that was challenging, and it may have been more successful if not for this. It was just that it appeared at a point in culture where there were two different movements in music that were oppositional. The Hammond Novachord landed somewhere between them. It did not appease either one of them due to just the nature of that cultural battle. And that battle was, of course, you had the avant-garde movement, the new music movement, where composers wanted to create new music in new contexts with new instruments. They wanted to reject the traditional and move towards this future that they envisioned. This started at the turn of the century and was completely bolstered by electronics and how they could create new instruments, new tonalities, new timbres. The avant-garde musicians really embraced this electronic movement. On the other side were the traditionalists, who were still doing music of the 19th century, and they wanted the traditional musical instruments with their traditional expressive elements. So you have these two movements, and the Novachord lands right between them without appeasing either of them or both of them. As an electronic instrument, the Hammond Novachord was incredibly traditional. It basically just provided a traditional musical instrument with futuristic timbres. The fact that it allowed you to engage in synthesis was amazing. The fact that it provided all these weird timbres was amazing, but it was presented in a traditional furniture-like shell with a traditional keyboard, and the people who were trying to invent new music looked at this and said, oh, come on, this is not the way to do this. Conversely, the traditionalists looked at this musical instrument and they said, okay, yeah, it looks like a musical instrument, it has a keyboard, we're cool with that. But when you played it, it had the action of an organ. It was not as expressive as the instruments that they really wanted, that they really embraced. You had a swell pedal. It basically came off as an organ to the traditionalists, which was not interesting to them. The timbres should have been, but of course the traditionalists were comparing the timbres to musical instruments that the timbres sounded like. And in that way, it didn't sound like a violin, it didn't sound like an oboe, it didn't sound like a choir or a piano, it didn't sound like any of the instruments the traditionalists would have wanted. There was also, in addition to both of these problems, there was the fact that people didn't know how to interact with an interface like that because nobody had experience with an electronic interface in the context of a musical instrument when you were just addressing the general population. This was a whole new thing. The same thing happened in the 1960s with synthesizers. Musicians didn't know how to operate them. Composers didn't know how to operate them. It was too hard. They had not experienced an interface like that. That's another problem that the Novachord provided, in addition to frustrating the avant-garde movement and the traditional movement. So the Novachord, despite the war, had some things going against it. Luckily, some musicians just took it for what it was and ran with it and made great music and great sound effects and had a great time with it. But unfortunately, it wasn't enough. The Hammond Novachord went out of production. It didn't get the opportunity to become the instrument it could have. It didn't get the opportunity to change with the times and, align with new musical movements and have technological developments improve it. It was cut off and other instruments went in new directions. But the consoling thing is that, for example, Bob Moog had experience with a Hammond Novachord and it influenced him. It inspired him. And in that way, a new electronic movement started. And this movement would include technology from the Novachord and improve on it. So basically, it was more like a hiatus between the 1930s, 40s, and the 1970s when polyphonic synthesis was taken back up. And that is the legacy of the Hammond Novachord.
The Hammond Novachord. a Hammond Novachord pamphlet from probably 1939, presenting the world's most versatile musical instrument, the Hammond Novachord. Every man, woman, and child shares the human desire to create for the sheer fun of creating. When this desire finds its outlet in music, the creator is fortunate indeed, for his effort not only gives joy to others, but adds lastingly to his own cultural resources. Personal taste, ability, convenience, sometimes tradition, determine the choice of the instrument. It might be the violin, the cello, the clarinet, or the trumpet. But the most popular choice is a keyboard instrument, the piano. The greatest musical literature has been written for it, and its keyboard is the gateway to glorious music for millions of people the world over. Now comes the Novachord, a new instrument, a new and more flexible tool to serve this creative musical desire. It employs a familiar keyboard. Anyone who can play the piano can draw from the Novachord its incredibly rich and varied musical effects. It is not a piano. It is not a substitute for the piano. It provides a myriad of tone qualities ranging from percussion tones reminiscent of the piano to singing tones like those of the violin or organ. No longer is the pianist limited to one type of tone because the Novachord is, in a sense, not one instrument, but several. It can justly be designated the world's most versatile musical instrument. Remember those childhood piano lessons? They can now pay big dividends. And you do not need to be an expert. The Novachord is delightfully versatile. Responsive to the novice, it still challenges the repertoire of the skilled musician. The joy and comfort of musical relaxation cannot be measured in material things. Okay, I think the most important thing here, the ultimate in musical self-expression, which I think is really just ad speak, but I mean, it is the ultimate in timbral creation for that time. There was very little at that time that had the ability to generate timbre like the Novachord. But the most important part here was they wanted to draw parallels to all of these instruments, but at the same time it said it is not a piano. It is not a substitute for the piano. And later they're going to be saying that about other instruments as well, although they walk this funny line of like, wow, you can make all these instrumental sounds, but this is not for that. This is the beginning of that sort of talk. I also, I love the notion that they're trying to advance a material thing as a means of joy and comfort and musical relaxation, and yet finish this quote over here under this man who's plainly having a vision, saying that it can't be measured in material things. Except for the control panel, the Novachord might be a new style of spinet grand. The keyboard has a compass of 6 octaves. The control panel is located conveniently above it. Any position of the controls will give a thrilling musical result. Simple directions for their use produce a variety of fascinating musical tones. In appearance, the beautiful walnut case of the Novachord is of the popular spinet design. It has a single keyboard comprising 72 playing keys. In addition to the familiar sustaining pedal, it has a foot-operated expression pedal similar to that of the Hammond organ, controlling the volume of the sound. The quality as well as the character of the tones produced by the Novachord are changed by changing the positions of the various controls located immediately above the playing keys. One set of controls alters the tone color. Another set governs the percussion or sustaining qualities. The Novachord should not be considered a substitute for the piano or any of the other musical instruments it can resemble. It is a new instrument, producing a profusion of beautiful tones, some familiar, most of them new. It is the ideal instrument for one who likes music and likes to create music himself. Without learning any new techniques, the pianist can produce tones similar to those of the violin, cello, French horn, Hawaiian steel guitar, organ, and many others. The Novachord adds enormously to the possibilities for musical enjoyment and entertainment everywhere. The Novachord is played like a piano. See, again, we have the same situation where there's some confusion, like, is this for being a piano or these instruments, or is it not? But I think it's pretty clear when they say The Novachord should not be considered a substitute for the piano or any of the other musical instruments. It can resemble it as a new instrument, producing a profusion of beautiful tones, some familiar, most of them new. So really, I mean, that is their goal, is to indicate like this thing does everything, but it also does things that no one's ever done, which is typically how synthesizers have been described since they have existed. The maximum in entertainment. The Novachord encourages a return to the home as a place of entertainment. The playing of popular songs and novelties takes on a new tang. Rhythmic patterns and musical thrills flow from the Novachord in the most amazing manner. It is hard to realize that no special technique is needed to work this magic. Simply play it as you would play a piano. This newest development in the science of electrical music is so startling that any description of what it will do is completely inadequate. To appreciate fully its many uses, one must play the instrument. While it will take hours to probe all of the musical possibilities, a short try-it-yourself visit to a Hammond dealer will give you an idea of the endless hours of pleasure in store for you. Endless hours of musical variety. The marvelous flexibility of the Novachord allows you to select an amazing variety of musical tones. Equally surprising is the ease with which you can immediately play the Novachord if you are at all familiar with the piano keyboard. The versatility of the Novachord is fascinating in the extreme. It leads you into many delightful experiments. A stately minuet gains immeasurably when played with the tone reminiscent of the ancient harpsichord. Your favorite melody can sing to you with a haunting, silken, violin-like voice. The languorous sound of a Hawaiian guitar seems to murmur aloha beneath your fingers. A soothing organ is yours for the asking, where the liquid notes of a flute enhance Schubert's immortal serenade. A multitude of voices is ready to do your bidding. Again, they just dance back and forth between here's how it can sound, here are the instruments it can sound like. But I mean, overall, what they're saying is like there is no limit to the timbres that you can employ with this instrument, and that's why it's special. It's interesting that the same is true actually for the Hammond organ. There are so many options there, but because they took it down the route of an organ, it's designed to sound like an organ instead of the additive synthesizer that it is. So there's that limitation there, but they did not employ that limitation here. This is not an organ, it's not a piano, it's something that makes its own sounds. And that's really interesting. The Novachord is fully guaranteed. The Novachord is a new instrument providing a maximum in musical entertainment. The electrical principle which it employs is also new and involves many inventions which promise to be very important to the future of music. It makes possible not only a new and wider scope of musical entertainment, but taps a new field of electrical science. The connecting link between this very new musical instrument and all others which have preceded it is the familiar keyboard. Above the 6-octave keyboard and located conveniently for the performer is the control panel for obtaining the many different tonal effects. The operation of these controls is simple and has a short practice period which will enable anyone to explore the vast tonal resources of this new instrument. The tone generator, which is at the heart of the instrument, is an outstanding example of the skill and experience of the Hammond organization. Besides the remarkable inventions involved, it is a production design that is the marvel of the people experienced in such mechanical and electrical details. The high order of design and workmanship which has given the Hammond organ its reputation for dependability assures the permanent reliability of the Novachord, which is fully guaranteed by its makers. The source of tone is standard vacuum tubes, 2 tubes for each note on the keyboard. No strings, hammers, reeds, or pipes are used. Only time-tested and standard vacuum tubes are employed. The light-duty service which they perform, far less than in radio and amplifier work, justifies an exceptionally long life expectancy. The other principal parts of the tone generator consist of fixed condensers and resistors of special design. Aside from the vibrati, there are no moving parts in the Novachord generator. The amplifiers and speakers used are the same reliable units that have been used in Hammond organs the world over. For accompaniment. Singers find in the Novachord a sympathetic and colorful accompaniment which increases their pleasure and lends additional charm to their performance. As a support for choral groups, glee clubs, and community choruses, the Novachord is invaluable. It can be orchestral, pianistic, or organ-like in the mood of the music demands. Produces exquisite solo effects. The beauty of the violin, the mellow song of the cello, how often have you wished that you could master them? Through the magic of the Novachord, you can simulate their tonal loveliness as easily as if you were playing the piano. And in addition, Novachord will enable you to provide your own accompaniment. Many other solo voices await your pleasure. The haunting loveliness of the horn, crystal clear flute tones, qualities reminiscent of the somber sweetness of the English horn, the pungently lyric oboe, all of these await only the touch of your fingers at the Novachord. A living, breathing vitality pervades every measure of Novachord music because of a new and completely revolutionary treatment of the vibrato. The result is a truly musical expression of deep artistic feeling. Practice is fun. Any piano teacher can immediately take advantage of the great new teaching opportunity which is opened by the invention of the Novachord. As a foundation of musical training, the Hammond Novachord is the logical beginner's instrument. It is a veritable gateway to all musical experience. No instrument hitherto considered the normal starting point can give so much fundamental musical background. Okay, so this was interesting because we did talk about how this instrument has technological developments that are important, and they touched on that as best they could in a way that people at that time could really understand. But yes, they did bring up that this has unique technology at its core and new, and I like where they said that it would be used in the future, and the top octave divide, which began with this instrument, was used extensively in, the 40 years after this instrument was created. So that is, they were, prophetic in that way. And they talked about the vacuum tubes and the truth about how the vacuum tubes are underused voltage-wise, so they will last a long time. They also mentioned that the vibrati are unique. It's interesting that they're like, oh, this is excellent for accompaniment. I can't really understand why anything would really be better than anything else for accompaniment. But I guess that's a good point that, you get to sing with unique timbres, and that's cool. The solo effects, again, likening all the unique timbres to instruments that we love, which is nice. And then this piano teacher thing, which drives me crazy because you don't learn to play a piano by starting on something with an organ action. It's like the worst thing you could possibly do. So this is kind of a red herring. Oh, yeah, your kids will learn piano on this. That's outrageous. Read what Sigmund Romberg, prominent composer, says about the Novachord. I have been totally fascinated with the Novachord. It represents the greatest advancement in musical instruments since the piano. The Novachord should contribute much to the development of music appreciation. I'm using it in my studio with my Hammond organ, and I find it very helpful in my work as a composer. I am pleased that I was the first person to own a Novachord. Already it has given me much pleasure. When I play it and hear the tonal qualities of the many instruments, I feel like a magician. The results are almost unbelievable. I wish you much luck. The bewitching melodies of the Student Prince, Blossom Time, and many other popular operettas have endeared this composer to countless multitudes. He was quick to envision the future of electric music, was one of the first to own a Hammond organ, and is the proud possessor of the first Novachord. Ferde Grofe, another celebrated composer, comments on the Novachord. Just a line to let you know that your Novachord has given me the surprise of my life. I have devoted my life to music and considered myself thrill-proof, but when I hear all the magical beauty that the Novachord puts at the command of my fingers, I must admit that I am amazed and delighted beyond words. I venture to predict that the thousands of piano players will welcome the Novachord as a new and intensely interesting source of musical enjoyment. You are to be congratulated in giving such a marvel to the world. The orchestration to George Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue stamped Ferde Grofe as an outstanding creative genius. Among his many compositions are such favorites as Metropolis and The Grand Canyon and Mississippi Suites. This eminent pioneer in modern symphonic American music is also the enthusiastic owner of a Hammond organ, which he uses extensively when composing. Okay, two things. It's cool that Sigmund Romberg, there you are. He's the guy who has the first Novachord. So that's an interesting thing. And then Ferdy Grofe, I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce his name. I'm sorry if it's wrong. He was really important because he did stuff at the New York World's Fair with the Novachord. There was a big display with a Novachord and a Novachord orchestra, and he was kind of the leader of that whole thing. So he's kind of relevant in the Novachord history for that reason. Installation is simple. The ordinary 115-volt alternating current used in house lighting is suitable for the operation of the Novachord. To install, simply plug into any ordinary outlet, turn on the switch, and it is ready to play. The current consumption is only 450 watts. Close frequency regulation is not necessary. Occupies 4.5 feet square. The Novachord is a completely self-contained unit. The amplifier and speaker equipment are located in the lower section of the console and provide ample volume for all ordinary installations. To fill large auditoriums, standard Hammond tone cabinets can be used to augment the normal volume. An expression pedal controls the tonal volume. A conventional sustaining pedal is duplexed for convenience, operating over the entire keyboard. Another sustaining pedal affects only the lower half of the keyboard. Control is easy to use. By merely moving this control up and down, the character of the tone can be varied from a sustained tone to a percussion tone. The color or voicing is changed by altering the position of the other controls on the panel. All controls are conveniently located and identified as to their function. Play as you would play a piano, the same technique plays the Novachord. Musically important, the Novachord is likewise important as a piece of furniture. The beautiful walnut console occupies a space 4.5 feet square. Completely self-contained, it requires only a plug-in connection to the nearest outlet. Okay, this is hilarious. I mean, it's interesting. This was at a time where electricity was still new enough that, like, there was some question about how things were powered and whether you could use typical electricity. And so it was really cool that they're like, yeah, this just plugs in and you're cool. It also explains the pedals, which is a good thing. And then the controls, you know, it's hard for us to understand in this day and age where we have all kinds of technology that's covered with controls. Back then, technology was not covered with controls. Barely any controls were on anything. So this whole notion of having a panel with controls was confusing and frightening to the average of people, even, you know, smart people, because it's like, holy cow, what do all these things do? How do I use a thing that has all of these controls? And so they were, you know, trying to calm everybody down. Oh, no, everything's cool. This is easy to use. It's just like a piano, except for it has all these controls. And then the notion like, hey, this musical instrument is important as a piece of furniture. It'll look good in your home. Your neighbors won't find you strange. While Hammond Instrument Company is only 10 years old, it has a record of successes, which has already built it a worldwide reputation for the manufacture of electrical precision instruments. Billions of synchronous electric clocks bearing the Hammond name are in use today. A little over 3 years ago, the Hammond organization introduced the now world-famous Hammond electric organ. Those who investigated the mechanism of the Hammond organ were not surprised that Hammond Instrument Company invented and produced it. The generator of the Hammond organ consists of rotating parts driven by a synchronous motor, and the Hammond Company was already noted for this highly specialized type of precision manufacturing. Designed and manufactured by Hammond. The Novachord is the creation of Mr. Lawrence Hammond, the president of the company. The invention involved in this instrument is another milepost in the march towards better music that is already marking this age of scientific advancement. Engineers interested in production design will find an absorbing interest in the mechanism of the Novachord. It is built to last many, many years and should rival the remarkable reliability record of the Hammond organ. The Hammond Novachord, including the woodwork, is manufactured in the 2 Chicago plants of the Hammond Instrument Company, 2915 Northwestern Avenue, Chicago, Illinois. So this is interesting because Hammond is a new company. You know, it started off making clocks and like mechanical card playing tables. And they reference that. They're like, yeah, we make clocks, but also we just started making this organ thing. which for us is pretty weird. And the Hammond organ's just a few years older than the Hammond Novachord. And they're like, look, we made the Hammond organ. Now we're making this other really great instrument, which is cool. And it's interesting that they're kind of bent on saying, and we invented this. It's interesting because, Hammond did not invent this concept. The concept was invented by Thaddeus Cahill with the telharmonium. What Hammond did was find a way to miniaturize it using technology that was not available to Thaddeus Cahill. So it's interesting that they're kind of defensive in this here. They're like, oh, this is something we invented, by the way. We did it, us. But yeah, I mean, the synchronous motor and whatever, yeah, it's different. So they did do something here. And the idea of taking that technology and making that, synthesizer technology and making it into an organ simulator was a great idea, obviously, and we're all very happy about it. Anyway, so this has been the Hammond Novachord pamphlet. My knowledge of the Novachord began thusly. I got really interested in vintage instruments around 1999. And in about 2000, I found Optigan.com that explored the amazing and wacky Mattel Optigan. And I thought, my gosh, a device that uses light to create sound and uses loops recorded with light. I absolutely had to have one. So I thought the best thing to do would be to contact the person who ran Optigan.com, P. Hicks, and say, hey, how do I get one of these? And his response was, well, where are you? And I'm like, well, I'm up in Minnesota. So he's like, where in Minnesota? And I was like, St. Paul? And he's like, okay, well, I know someone in St. Paul who wants to get rid of some Optigans. And if you're really lucky, he'll just give them to you. I was like, what? Anyhow, he gives me the number of this man named George Hardenberg. And I called George, not knowing what to expect. And George answered, and he was very gruff. He sounded very impatient, did not sound at all like a person who'd be interested in an Optigan, let alone someone who would be interested in giving an Optigan or more to a stranger. But I was like, hi, yeah, I was talking to P. Hicks, and he said you had some Optigans you wanted to get rid of. He's like, yeah, I got a lot of them, but I got a couple I want to get rid of. You want them? I'm like, yes, I do. He's like, okay. Well, what else are you interested in? You ever heard of the Novachord? And I'm like, no, I don't know what that is. He's like, oh, yeah, well, I think you'll love it. I'll give you one of those, too. I'm like, oh, okay. He's like, meet me at my theater. I'm like, your theater? Yes, I'll meet you at your theater. I'm certain that this guy was completely insane because none of it made any sense. But sure enough, he gave me the address to this theater in Mound, which is a area slightly north of downtown St. Paul. And, or is it north? I don't know, west, northwest? I'm not sure. Anyway, I go to this old derelict Mound theater. It's, it was obviously a theater in the past, but it wasn't one then. And it was all sort of locked up and boarded up and everything. And I went there and I went to the door and this very elderly man answered. George Hardenberg apparently was a great businessman who was very interested in analog computing technology, and that's what he, made his money in, and apparently was very wealthy. And he, at some point, bought the Mound Theater, and at some point started using it as storage for all of his equipment. So he lets me into the building, and there's right there in the lobby of the theater, there's the Novachord. It looked like a square piano, one of those old square pianos. And he brought me around to the front of it and he's like, it still works too. Here, turn it on. And we turned it on and let it warm up and I played it. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is like, it sounds like a synthesizer. He's like, well, it is. That's why. And then he led me into the theater and it was an impossible wonderland of vintage computer technology, music technology, musical instruments, amplifiers, the computers from like the 1970s sci-fi television shows and things with the reels. Like there were huge like pipe organ pipes just stacked, and I saw a lot of musical instruments in there, including 2 Optigons, which were apparently for me. So we took those out, and he's like, yeah, if you want this Novachord, you can have it too. And I was like, I do. So I went and I got a U-Haul, and a friend of mine, Glenn Kindleman, helped me move it to my house. So then, of course, we get this giant 500-pound instrument to my house, and it's a matter of like, it has to go in the basement because it's not going to fit anywhere else in the house, and where would we put it elsewhere in the house? So he and I struggled to dismantle this thing. I mean, I had dismantled it for moving, which terrified me, but we struggled to get the dismantled parts down the stairs. Piece of plywood right there. Could we set it on that, and I can just come out and make this into a room? Because, okay, now we just got to carry it down the stairs upright.
So this is going to go down like this, and then like this, and then around like that?
What if, because it'd be easier, what if I tipped it that way, and you, oh yeah, you don't like that idea.
I'm trying to move here, out of arm's way.
Don't break it. I'm going to have to ask you to leave this house for saying that about my wife after we get this down.
What happened?
So, how much would a mover cost? It was not easy. They did not want to go down the stairs, but luckily we figured it out and got it into the old rec room of my house. And I started, I was kind of terrified because I dismantled it and I had George Hardenberg's instructions about how to put it back together, but I had no guarantees. I had no idea what was going to happen. I thought, like, I'll get it home and it won't work. And I had to disconnect a lot in order to move it. So I got it down there, and first I decided to clean it. It was extremely dusty and dirty, so I cleaned all the different parts. I am going to chronicle the reassembly. Well, first of all, the cleaning. I don't know if I can reassemble it myself. This little number here weighs probably, I don't know, more than me. No, not really. Nothing could weigh more than me. Basically, I'm going to chronicle the cleaning up. You can see that it's pretty dirty. I don't know how much good I can do because there's so much fine work here that would need to be done. But I'm going to try and clean this up as best as possible. Back in here, you can see it's pretty dirty back there. Clean that up. Probably so that these devices right here, the amplification can fit in there. I'm going to clean that all up. I'm going to clean the case all up. Try and put this thing back together as best as possible to make it the beautiful device that it is. So that's what you're going to be seeing. I'll take you stepwise through the process, and we'll see what we can do. Okay, I'm starting to clean here. You can see it's getting a little cleaner. We still have a long way to go from here. So these things. Well, this is about as clean as it's going to get. I'm not sure if this is the top amplifier or the bottom one, or even if it's an amplifier. I'm pretty sure it is, but I have to find out. So where things plug into it, I need to find out which things. They're over here, this stuff, one of these, plugs in somewhere over there, and they're all hanging down. Oh, I'm just not very articulate today. But in any case, one of these things has been cleaned and is ready to be put back into the Novachord and hopefully work. Okay, now this one is clean. As clean as I could get it, anyway. We got both of them totally clean and ready to be installed back in the device if I can find out which one goes where. Should be very interesting. There are 2 levels. One of them goes on the top level, one on the bottom level. and I have no idea which one goes where, but I do have the diagram that might be able to tell me, and if not, I'll use the plugs to see which plug reaches where, and then we'll put that back in. Eventually we'll get to deal with this. How fun that'll be. All of these tiny little springs need to be connected to precise points on the bottom of this, deep down there. So that should be very interesting. Okay, we've cleaned this compartment up so that it is no longer filthy. It has some wax stains from drippings from some of the capacitors, I'm told, which causes me no shortage of trepidation, but you can see I've replaced the springs upon which those devices rest on the top shelf. Shortly I'll replace it on the bottom shelf. Just wanted to show it when it was clean as opposed to how disgusting it was. You can actually see the wood now. Before you couldn't see that was wood there. But those are all the wires I have to find a connection for. This one I'm pretty thrilled about. I have no idea where that's going to go. Anyway, so back to work. I eventually got it as clean as I was going to get it, and I was able to put it back together, and it seemed like I put it back together the way it was supposed to be.
Or the cheese you love on the inside. Is there anything that pizza can't do? The Insider Pizza from Pizza Hut. Another one of the best pizzas under one roof.
Got one spring connected. One spring connected. Well, it's seated. Who knows whether it's right, but it's seated. I reassembled it, which was no easy task. The control section of it is enormous and heavy and just all tubes. And I got the whole thing put back together, and I plugged it in. I turned it on, and played it, and it worked. It's actually on. Well, you can hear the vibrato starter working. Should we try it? Only one speaker's working, I think. Yeah, I've got some problems, but oh, my battery's dead. Sorry. Well, you heard it. The Novachord works. I was able to play it. Unfortunately, it was not easily tuned. I had to do some tricks to get anything tuned out of it. But I did get it going, and it worked for a couple of years. And I recorded it. I used recordings of it in theatrical productions I'd done. I put it in a couple of my pop songs. I sampled it. It was really a great thing, and it made me very happy. Eventually, I realized one day that I had not played it in a month, and I know that all vintage instruments want to be played. So I ran downstairs, turned it on, went upstairs to get some stuff done while it warmed up, Came back downstairs, the whole basement was filled with this acrid white smoke. I assumed that this was not a good sign and that something had gone wrong. And sure enough, I went to the Novachord and it was not playing. So that was terrifying. I shut it off, and I later found out that what I was probably breathing were boiled PCBs, which is some sort of horrendous poison that probably shortened my life, but not yet though. Anyway, so it was broken, and then I kept it for several years, moved across the country and kept it, and it was the most beautiful non-working thing I had. Then I was contacted by Danny Wilson in the UK, and she wanted to renovate it and put it back together and get it going and, do whatever with it. And so she actually paid to have it shipped to the UK, where it lived, where she brought it back to life, and where Steve Howell and she made the Hollow Sun product. That is the Novachord. That's actually number 346, the Novachord I had. So it lives on. It was sort of immortalized, and to my knowledge, it is still functioning today in the UK. That's how I got into the Novachord.